Hello, I am Dr. Gloria Boutte, and I'm a Carolina Distinguished Professor at the University of South Carolina. Today, I want to talk a little bit about African diaspora literacy. What you see in the background here is a book that was co-published in 2018 by Lamar Johnson, myself, Gwenda Green, and Dawana Smith. And the book is entitled African Diaspora Literacy, The Heart of Transformation in K-12 Schools and Teacher Education. And it has stories and research and theories about how African diaspora literacy looks around the world. This is a perfect time to talk about African diaspora literacy. And actually, any time is a perfect time since Africa is the cradle of civilization. And so it's timeless and timely as well. So, the United Nations has declared this decade, 2015 to 2024, as the International Decade for People of African Descent to call attention to the pervasive and gross injustices that Black people face around the world. And another example of the global recognition of the need to embrace Black humanity, the humanity of Black people, is the Black Lives Movement matter. So this is a good time to talk about it. So what is African diaspora literacy? In 1992, Dr. Joyce King defined diaspora literacy as Black people's knowledge of our collective story and cultural dispossession. And when I write about her work, because she's talking about African people, I just added African diaspora literacy as the process of helping people become literate about African descendant people's cultures, languages, histories, and ways of knowing and so forth. So becoming literate about, a group of people who make up nearly 20% of the world's population. African diaspora literacy relates to people with African origins wherever we are in the world. So whether we're in the Caribbean, in Africa, in the US, in Brazil, Europe, or whatever, as you can see on the map, we've been dispersed all over the world. And with us, we brought enduring legacies and what some call Africanisms, which I'll talk about. So African diaspora literacy, as we become literate and learn about African people, we acknowledge that African people are not monolithic, and at the same time, we share a collective history. Indeed, we are people who are not on the continent of Africa and who are in the diaspora in other places, including the Caribbean. We are the sixth region of the African Union. So African diaspora literacy, think about African diaspora literacy as Black people's knowledge of our collective stories and our cultural dispossession. African diaspora literacy challenges and critiques social inequities while building the racial and ethnic uplift of Black people who are minoritized in society. So one key principle of African diaspora literacy began with African history. As Dr. Carter G. Woodson told us in his book in 1933, his classic book, The Miseducation of the Negro, the education of any people should begin with the people themselves. So let's lean into that for a minute. Should begin with the people themselves. But Negroes thus trained have been dreaming about the ancients of Europe and about those who have tried to imitate them. And even the language of African people has been, as he said, the Negro has been taught to despise his own language and think it's something wrong with it and think it's a broken down African tongue instead of realizing that it has a rich history. So rather than study African languages, they try to study French and other things which are not important to the healing of Black people and understanding our own linguistic histories. Another key principle African diaspora literacy is whenever you're teaching about African people, always start before enslavement or colonization because there were rich histories. This is a very long map that Tony Browder put together that shows 8,000 years of history of African people. And where this man is standing with the pink, green, yellow sort of scarf around his neck, hopefully you can see my pointer. That's about the place where slavery begins. And so all this history before um, people don't learn about. So to become literate means to know that. In fact, in my book, Educating African American Students and How the Children, I suggest that these three things should be taught about African people. What was African life like before contact with Europeans? How did it change? So what is African, in our case, African American life like at the time of Europeans, but it could be Caribbean life. What happened? In the US, there's a group that refers to African Americans as AUSA, Africans in the USA, so AUSA, because we brought with us Africanism, but as culture adapts, they manifest themselves in ways that are different and similar. So, what does that look like? That might be different than a person who's born in continental Africa. So, what does it look like in the Caribbean? And then, of course, continuing that whole continuum, the contemporary life of African people and African American or Caribbean people. What's going on now? And throughout all of this, with African diaspora literacy, we try to show how these periods are overlapping. But I suggest in my book 6 major periods that you want to cover. And in this, I'm using African American as an example because that's where I am. But you can insert Caribbean in that or any other cultural group that you want to, or any other national group. So they began with ancient Africa as we become literate. All the kingdoms, Gali, Mali, Songhai, Ethiopia, Kush, they need to learn very deeply what those values and principles were and sort of how they moved through time. How have they adapted? Enslavement, when we teach about enslavement as a second period, we teach it from the point of view of agency, the strengths, what African people brought to this country, how they built this country, how they resisted. When we're teaching about African people, we don't teach them from a position of a victim. And Reconstruction, the same thing. Jim Crow segregation, civil rights, or Black nationalism, and back to contemporary time for Africans in America and Africans in the diaspora. So we're not frozen in history, we're only historical people, just to show this whole continuum. And been very successful doing this work with children in a curriculum that my husband and I, Dr. George Johnson, do called Doctors of the Diaspora. These are illustrations of children kind of depicting what they learned about these different historic periods over a period of time. This is not a Black History Month lesson. This is ongoing work. And so you see that some have Adinkwa symbols, like that's courage, hope. One of the things we teach them is we use the Adinkra symbols as a proxy for African values, and recognizing there are lots of different symbols that are out there, but we decided to use Adinkra symbols. And so they can see how hope, for example, moves throughout every one of those periods, historical periods, and so forth, or perseverance, or other Africanisms that are there. So the reason African diaspora literacy is important is because it's a way of healing. And when we think about African people, we have been dismembered. Our histories have been removed. We've been taken apart. And so to become whole again, we have to start with what we left out. And as writer Alice Walker says, the healing begins where the wound was made. And the wound was made at the time of contact with Europeans, continuing today. And she says the injury lives longer in the mind than at the point of injury. So that means in order to heal ourselves and remember, we have to learn about, we have to become literate about the African diaspora. Now, in schools, part of the difficulty in effectively teaching children from African diaspora backgrounds in ways that are healing and restorative is that many educators don't understand and respect that there is something called Black culture. And if you don't know, again, I'm going to show you a slide, but there are decades of research out there about what that looks like. We've taken delegations to different parts of Africa to study connections between Africa and, let's say, for example, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Ghana. These are some of the places we've gone. And in the Caribbean, we're going to go to Barbados, but all of us have these legacies. But there is something called Black culture. And while it is different in content, the deep culture remains the same. A lot of people believe that the content they teach in school is neutral and cultural free and don't recognize that African voices, perspectives, epistemologies are left out. We teach in African, when you're trying to become literate about the African diaspora, these are some of the dimensions. This is based on the work of Wade Borkin and others who have shown these are some of the enduring parts of Black culture. There are others. But these are some that you can look for, and you can integrate this in the work that you're doing. Spirituality, harmony, movement, verb, affect, communalism, expressive individualism, oral tradition, social time perspective, perseverance, and improvisation. And another assumption of African diaspora literacy is not only are we learning about Black people, but we can learn from them as well. And this at work, even though when I talk about the healing piece, it's healing for Black people, but it can be healing for other people, including whites. It's particularly important for white children and students because they have been taught distortions of history. Black culture has been erased and told in inaccurate ways. So this is a picture of my husband and I. We have a curriculum called Doctors of the Curriculum, well, Doctors of the Diaspora, sorry. And we're in an all-white school here, majority white. We've gone to several, but we're teaching them, this African history that they haven't learned. So all of this is about really, if we can summarize it using an Adinkra symbol, Sankofa, which a lot of people know. It's a mythical bird. Its body is facing forward to represent the future, and the head is looking backwards to represent the past. And the bird has an egg in its mouth, which represents holding on and protecting the children, the future. The best way to fight an alien and oppressive culture is to embrace your own. That's an African proverb that summarizes what all of this is about. And these are books that you can learn more from. Now let me figure out if I can figure out how to stop recording. That would be really wonderful.